The recording is in progress, and I, along with my best friend Magnus, have decided to wander into the forest to look for the half dead person that will turn one or maybe both of us into a werewolf if we're lucky. But before that happens, my name is John McDonald, and as we turn towards thoughts of autumn here in the equator where it gets cooler as you get into fall, we turn to thoughts of Teen Wolf. We were going to have this for the 20th episode, but because we want to do a Hocus Pocus one,
Mm.
spoiling that a little bit, but it's something to look forward to before the second film comes out.
Woo!
We thought we'd give you a little treat, a little treat to get you through your transition to Halloween, and we're going to talk about Teen Wolf. Hello, Magnus.
Hello. It's so nice to see you again. And how have you been keeping?
I think I've been keeping fairly well. I've been working fairly hard. I had a really great meeting last night about things that are coming in my future projects, at least one of them. And I have some thoughts about Teen Wolf, so we'll see how excited people are at the end of my thoughts about Teen Wolf, because I feel like this show, it's not this show that has caused me profound reflection, but everything that surrounded the show. So I think it's going to be good, and I like the cooler weather too. It helps me think straighter. So
Indeed. Well, um, yes, I'm excited to speak about Teen Wolf as well. It was quite a little cultural phenomena during the mid 2010s. It's weird to say to look at the mid 2010s
it's
some time ago now.
actually it's actually the third attempt that MTV made in my
Mm,
generation for original programming. So the first one was this game show called Fear, where they would send these like five people into like this abandoned haunted house, plantation, navy vessel, some sort of abandoned American structure. And then they
right.
would essentially send them out on little challenges and pull horrible pranks on them. Uh, it came out after the fact of the show. They actually had like people they had hired to make it seem like there was ghostly stuff going on to scare them. Um, Fear had one of the best theme songs. I think it was I'll have to Google it, but it was a really great theme song. I think it was by Godsmack or something like that. But
Oh,
and the next one was the not as well known uh, pop soap opera Spider Games that took place in college, and it
mm,
had a very like it had kind of a Passions feel, but if Passions hadn't been supernatural. And there was a really great story with the queer character in the first season. So Teen Wolf is like the third attempt at
okay.
MTV attempting to do something new for our generation, and you could argue Teen Wolf succeeds because it's
Yes.
succeeded more than the other two. Um,
Mm.
yeah,
Yes, it was pretty much a breakout show of its time. And when you have a look at it, so it ran from 2011 to 2017, over 6 seasons. I don't want to say this, but it lasted a lot longer than a number of its contemporaries
it
throughout its run.
did. It came out 2 years after Vampire Diaries. By the way, that started
Mm,
in 2009. And obviously, of course, the other really big Americana supernatural show was Supernatural at the time. Uh,
yes.
but I think this show had more awards potentially. The first season is the highest rated, but it has won three Saturn Awards for Best Youth Oriented Television Series, 13 Teen Choice Awards, nine for the
Mhm.
actors, and four for the series itself. And then there is a movie coming up, which a lot of people are very excited about. And because Paramount Plus is
Yes.
so accessible, I'm going to argue that Paramount Plus is also the streaming service that has done all of the recent South Park specials,
Mm.
which I think is a good direction for that show because I think Matt and Trey were running out of little steam doing weekly episodic content.
Oh,
So I
yeah.
feel like South Park got a new lease on life on Paramount Plus. Ironically, Teen Wolf isn't on all Paramount Pluses. A lot of people that want to see it on streaming have to do so through Hulu, if it's on your Hulu. but it is available for streaming on some platforms that you may already have. If you haven't seen the 6 seasons, and like one of the other shows that we've covered, it does almost every season do a part one and part two. So it
Mm.
does have a little bit of a Once Upon a Time feel to it, in that half seasons generally have contained stories, um, but it's very different from Once Upon a Time.
Yes, because Once Upon a Time, with its framing device, sort of switching back and forth every episode between the present and a character's past or some related story, I would argue that Teen Wolf narratively does it a bit better because it doesn't have to rely on sort of
Yeah.
not all the time. There is some past occasions that crop up. I mean, showing young Derek and such to add background to his character, but because they don't have to do it all the time, narratively, I think it flows a bit better with each other. And it's not to say I didn't like how Once Upon a Time did it, because that really did add. You certainly felt as if both he was adding volume to the show, and you were getting a good bird's eye view into each character's past in that
Yeah.
sense. So they do it differently, but I like how Teen Wolf did it slightly better.
And there are a lot of layers to Teen Wolf. When we talk about Teen Wolf and theming, and I kind of want to do overall before we really dig into the show, because for
Yeah.
me, the show itself is almost beside the point as to what it represents. But when I think about Teen Wolf, I'm going to use the term pastiche. And now,
Okay.
if you don't know what that means, if you've ever seen the movie Moulin Rouge, this is really
Mm.
overt pastiche. This is where you take like Nirvana's famous Nirvana songs and you put it in, 1900s France, where Nicole Kidman is dancing and seducing Ewan McGregor.
Yeah.
But so this is a very gentle pastiche. This is pastiche in a way where if Riverdale hadn't completely gone insane, it probably would look a lot like Teen Wolf. And pastiche
Yes.
is really about mixing of genres and times. And for Teen Wolf,
Mhm.
that means it kind of exists both in a modern time, but it also has a feel of source material because it is very, 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 very loosely based on the Michael J. Fox movie, which is more of a comedy, which is more exuberant, which is not anywhere near kind of
Mm.
this ghost story, urban legend feel
Yeah.
that Teen Wolf the show goes for. And every time someone says it, I'm like, yeah, that's a very loose source material is what I call it. Because if you put the two side by side, they're nothing like. Spiritually, Teen Wolf is more of a Buffy show than it
Yes.
really is a Teen Wolf show, and it shows it for better or for worse for me.
You can see the influences that past. Um, how would you describe it? Um,
I mean,
America.
if you want to talk about like the American version of being human, it does have some of that underground supernatural to it as well.
Yes, of the fantasy of the supernatural, inhabiting the same world as
Yeah,
mankind, but
and it
sort of
yeah
almost existing parallel to it.
yeah,
Um,
and it does have some of that same violence. It has a bit of Harry Dresden to it, so there's an urban fantasy
I
feel,
was thinking
even though
about
it's
how.
suburban.
Mm.
Yeah, so it does. This is where I'm gonna get hashtag controversial yet brave like Trixie Mattel. Um, for me, the point of Teen Wolf is not that it's a show on its own. Um, the point for me is that it looks at other things that were successful and it created its own content, but
Mm.
it stands on those shoulders. And I think if it had been either a more well known cast or a cast that couldn't handle it, it probably wouldn't have even gotten past the first season. I think a lot of it had to do with casting super hot, super pop star actors. And I don't think Dylan O'Brien was. I think Dylan O'Brien was kind of the obvious choice because he was just coming off of being that fresh faced kid. And I
Mm.
think the first Maze Runner movie had just come out when he was cast for
Ooh.
this.
Uh,
So this is really a trajectory of a career for him. I could be
Mhm.
wrong about that, but I feel like Maze Runner 1 happened and then he was filming Teen Wolf and then the Maze Runner sequels. I could be wrong. I only saw like half one of the Maze
Uh,
Runner films, but it's not like same timeline, right?
mm, Maze Runner came out in 2014, according to my data. Teen Wolf started in 2011. So I
Yeah.
would almost argue that Dylan had probably done. I could look into the principal filming, but that might be way too many details for the minute.
It
It
does
kind of
take
feels
a
to me.
long time to do the CGI, but yeah, it's totally backwards and that's fine. I'm happy to be wrong.
Yeah. Um, perfect. Oh, perfectly fine. So you see, we can admit it when we need to correct our details.
That's
But
true.
I think the principle of what you were saying is right. He was a young, hot actor. Um, he just done like season one of Teen Wolf. He was going on to season two, but at the same time, he was spanning out into films with the first Maze Runner
Yeah.
because that was probably filmed in 2013, etc. So yeah, it's definitely the start of Dylan's career and setting himself up for his future success.
Yeah. And I have a lot of thoughts about Dylan, not because I think he's a bad actor,
No.
but because I compare him a lot, almost like he's a straight version of Kurt from Glee. He's got that kind of same,
Yes.
very not femme, but a very twink energy to me. And
Yes.
because I always think of Teen Wolf in the same way, because I was on Tumblr at the point where Teen Wolf really started to hit. And
Hmm.
so, along with Vampire Diaries and Super Hulock, they were a
Mm.
big part of people essentially on Tumblr in fandoms really beginning fetishizing characters.
Yeah.
For me, Teen Wolf is kind of the start of the end of what I call Web 2.0. So in Web 1.0, everything is very spaced out. If you wanted a fandom show, you had to know how to search for it. Google wasn't a thing yet. Everything was very like in its own little box. And a lot of
Yeah.
things like Angel Fire and GeoCities, things had to be hot linked together like we were in little tree houses essentially.
Mm.
Web 2.0, you start getting LiveJournal, fanfiction.net, you start getting Tumblr when people still wanted things like Tumblr University before DashCon. And so closer to the end of Web 2.0 before what we're in now, where everything is getting commoditized and everything is about reels and it's not really about the art anymore as much. There is a lot of that. I see a lot of it on Twitter. So don't at me about that. There's a lot of art, but like there was an ease of access in Web 2.0 that is much harder now. There wasn't so much about the algorithm. It was much easier to find things just by searching for them
Yes.
in hashtags. And so like Teen Wolf for me, the story of it is how people responded to it and made art for it and how accessible that was. I cannot tell you the amount of season 1 stuff. Like I didn't watch season 1 of the show because I didn't have to. I saw everything in GIFs and it told me the whole story. And now that's almost impossible. So for me,
Mm.
Teen Wolf is a hallmark of an accessibility that you don't get much anymore.
Yeah.
Like things like Revenge, which really should have been a Tumblr based show. Um,
Mm.
you just don't get the same thing you get with like Teen Wolf and Supernatural, Super Hulock, and even Glee.
Yeah.
So yeah.
The thing is, so Teen Wolf came out around the, as you say, the start of the Web 2.0 time, or was what I look at as sort of like um, the explosion of a lot of of teen drama fandoms, like really starting to connect in an in-depth, like more of an in-depth level online, because it mirrors the explosion of social media as well. As you say, it's a lot easier to. It was becoming a lot easier to find um, your tribe, as it were, to borrow a term. There was a lot of yeah, there's a lot of fandoms that were developing from the start of the internet onwards, people finding each other and creating online communities. But the growth of Tumblr and the founding of Facebook and such around these times really allowed teenagers to start connecting and creating really in-depth online fandoms, I
Yeah.
would say.
There
Um,
really wasn't fandom on Facebook until it became something anyone could join, even outside of
Yeah.
college.
Mm.
Uh, if it was being used for that purpose, it wasn't being used for that in 2004 when I was coerced into joining all those years
No.
ago. But it was really about LiveJournal was a place for
Mm.
writers. Tumblr was a place for visual artists that then transitioned to fan fiction as
Mm.
fanfiction.net morphed into what would become AO3. So there was always a need for how do we express our fan art and our desire for these characters.
Mm.
And Teen Wolf made a really accessible story for desire for teens. It's very
Yes.
clear, especially in season 6, because season 6 especially is heavy with themes of graduation versus duty. But through the
Yeah.
whole series, it has that kind of freaks and geeks high school Boston public trope going on, where it's you have to save the
Yeah.
world, but you also have to be in detention, kind of thing. That's the crux of an entire episode, almost actually, in the first season.
Mm.
So when I say it has a lot of Buffy, that's not a ding. That's not saying that
No.
Buffy. I
Yes.
mean, Buffy obviously is the gold standard in a lot of ways for neo suburban horror, but there's something very faculty-esque about this as well.
Yes.
um there's something very the crafts about Teen Wolf as well.
Uh,
The
yeah.
influences are always from other things, and
Mm.
then from the stories, from the ancient stories, by the time they get to the Nagutse and things like that. Yeah.
I would argue Teen Wolf very nicely fits into what I view as a rural Americana fantasy genre. Um, this genre is settings are usually like townships near like large sprawling rural lands and such, like old forests or mountainous ranges, etc. Um, it not necessarily like inner city, etc. But it's almost in touch with um, either myths or spirituality. There's the ability for an easy crossover between um, on the one side of things like modern American life and its troubles and issues going into, and then the other side is stepping into almost like a supernatural, dare I say, almost an unreality versus like what is normally considered like settled reality. And often the line will blur when you
Yeah.
have these people straddling both these worlds, which is what Scott ends up becoming in the first
Yeah.
episode. He
Yeah.
becomes straddled between two worlds.
Yeah. So when we say things like it's relatable, and I use the phrase like
Mm.
world within a world, which is part
Yes.
of a magic genre, it's a trope. That's not necessarily bad.
No.
To clarify, relatability is good because it means more people will watch. The
Yes.
downside of relatability is kind of what happened to Batman, where people got so freaked out about it being queer coded in Batman and Robin that you get a course correction with
Mm.
Christopher Nolan. Not to say the
Yeah.
art is worse, but the idea of relatability, the idea of how we tell a horror story episodically on TV, really, when you look at Teen Wolf, spiritually a successor to Buffy, still ongoing, and
Yeah.
partly that has to do with how big the breakout stars were from this. I'm comfortable in saying that Tyler Posey and Tyler Dillon, both Tylers and Dylan, were really kind of the breakout stars of the show. That's really hard because they're both named Tyler. I can't. Uh, Tyler Posey and Tyler Hoechlin, whose name I've never heard
Yes.
pronounced last name, so I could be saying Hoechlin wrong my entire life. But like, there's also Colton Haynes, the dude that
Mm.
plays the
Jackson.
Jackson. Yeah, the dude plays Colton Haynes Jackson, the guy that played the deputy, Alan Parrish, I think his name is. I can't remember his name. I have a list of characters' names, but as I was kind of like reading synopses to refamiliarize myself, like everyone's name started to blur together. So this show is really great because, like Buffy, it has an ensemble cast feel, but nobody gets lost until they die and they're kicked off the series, essentially. Even if they come back for a cameo in season 6, you know, all that growth off screen that you don't get to see, except for in the case of like Colton Haynes' character coming out and accepting himself. But that's
Mm,
also a reflection of Colton Haynes' real life,
yeah.
which kind of leads me to my second and third point about the show that's not really the show itself, but the culture surrounding it. Um,
Mm,
and so before we get to the show, there's kind of 2 points I want to make. And
mm,
one of these is going to make sense. One of these is going to be another controversial yet brave statement that I
okay.
feel like we need to say as a fandom because I think we actually need to deal with it. Um, me being a white cisgendered queer man, of course, dealing with that, I have a lot of points of privilege. So I will put that out there first. But so the first thing to think about when we talk about Teen Wolf is that its height of popularity matched with the point in Supernatural's popularity, where we were talking a lot about queer baiting,
Mm,
along with Sherlock, and even in some ways BBC's Merlin had the same problem. And so Teen Wolf's rise also coincides with the conversation that was happening, especially on Tumblr, about is this show, are these characters, are these actors queer baiting us as fans? Are
yeah.
they creating queer coded content or out and outright queer characters they can fridge? Lexi from The
Mm,
100 had the same problem.
mm,
Um, some people talk about Lee Pace as Ned on Pushing Daisies as a queer bait character, which I don't know if I agree with. This is not a problem that was had by high prestige shows that were happening on HBO and Showtime, like the one about the family that runs the funeral parlor. I can see them.
oh, 6 feet under?
6 Feet Under, yeah. 6 Feet Under never had this queer baiting conversation, but Teen Wolf and Super Hulock were kind of around the same time having a conversation
Mm,
about both about how much access the fans thought they deserved to the people that were these characters,
yeah.
but also how much queer content was in the show. Is it enough? What kind of representation is it? So when we talk
Mm,
about Teen Wolf, we can't talk about it without acknowledging that that kind of ghost of a conversation exists for some people that loved it, some people that loved it and left, some people that defended it vigorously and were wrong, and some people that defended it vigorously and were right, for better or for worse. And of course, I've never met Jeff Davis, so I can't talk to him. I can't talk to the content created by the writers. But what I can say is that, especially now, seeing how the two Tylers have interacted in this press release kind of stuff they're doing for the film, I feel
mm,
comfortable in saying that now I don't think it's queer baiting, but there was a very specific period of time watching these gifts happen, which is
yeah.
how people participate in the show, where I had some specific thoughts and wonders of, is this actually something MTV is doing to queer bait without actually having queer storylines? And this
Mm,
was before they brought the twins in, one of whom is openly queer. This was before they brought in the guy whose name starts with a K that I can't pronounce.
oh,
I'm sorry, everyone. I'm really bad at pronouncing their
can't
names. They really all do
remember.
blend together, and I apologize for that. I'm a bad person, and I will fully admit that.
Okay, okay, okay. I really can't remember either. I do apologize.
Yeah, but
Um,
he came on later. So in the first couple of seasons, it really was a straight cast, and
yes,
werewolf in horror always had a queer connotation to it. So until the arrival of the twins, one of whom is was openly queer on the show, I believe, and might actually have been openly
yeah,
queer in real life,
you.
it really did have that feeling of queer baiting to some people because they were doing a lot of queer coding with Scott, especially, but there were no real queer relationships. There's a couple of scenes where they'd go into like they went to a rave and they talked about bisexuality. Um, one of the tattoos that Scott actually gets, you could think about as queer coded because it's nearly a queer tattoo, one of his armband tattoos.
Yes.
But it's very much like when you think about the show, when you talk to people of a certain age that were there when it happened live, there was a real conversation of, are they baiting us? Should we invest in this show as queer people? You know, what kind of representation are we seeing? And I'm not going to say
Hmm.
whether or not it was queer baiting. I don't think it was now, and I do wonder how much we as
But
fans contributed to that in
Mhm.
some ways.
Well, it all feeds. So my thoughts on it. It all feeds off on what one another. Um, in terms of the cast was aware of like the shipping that was going on between Stills and Derek, Stills and Scott, Stills with everyone else, including like probably a nearby tree, etc.
Well, there's
Everyone
there
loves shopping.
I have trouble believing nobody shipped him with his dad. Like, and I think this is one of those
You,
things that we had to grapple with about this because we did
yes.
it with Hopper and Stranger Things too. We
Mhm.
took this
Yes.
authority figure and you kind of just pale-male ship him with someone,
Yep.
and at some point you have to wonder, is because if you're not working to actually examine the taboo, you're really just making porn at that point. And you have to
Yes.
wonder how much work that did,
Mm.
for the queer community. Because just getting your rocks off because you wrote a fanfic isn't doing as much work for the queer community as you thought.
No. um, indeed. So I know that the cast were aware of it during the series, because the fans were kept asking if Derek and Stills can have a moment. Is there a possibility that Stills can kiss Derek at some point, or maybe he has a crush on him? They were building this up, and the thing is, the fans were building this up, but the cast acknowledged that this was a thing, and I believe at one point Tyler, Derek's actor, went on record to say that they were aware of it. It's up to the writers what they feel, and it's also up to whether Dylan, Stills' actor, would feel comfortable doing such a thing. And that's the other side of the coin we have to acknowledge in this whole thing. Is the fact is, while we may ship characters together, at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge the fact that these real life characters are being played by real life actors. And is it really fair for us to take our fantasies and push them beyond what we have and what we're sharing with people of fellow interest and pushing it towards real life people whose sexuality probably doesn't mirror what we want them to be in our fictionalized version? And I feel that's going a bit unfair there.
Yeah.
I know this is me saying it, and I have a lot of ships, but I always acknowledge the fact that ships are my own creation. They're in my mind. They're not always acknowledging what the reality of a character is, but that's my interpretation and my version of said character. Now, I know the fact, so going back on track, I know that the cast acknowledged it and nothing ever came of it, but I do think that sometimes the actors did play along with it, like not in a malicious way, but there was always these cute set photos of like Tyler and Dylan playing around with each other. That infamous one on the boat
Yeah.
where
And
Tyler puts his finger on Dylan's lips to shush him and stuff
there's
like that.
Ian and JR being really good friends. We got a lot of, so you got your daddy kink in there too, which is really nice.
Yes.
Um,
S- um, sorry,
yeah.
you go ahead, sir.
I think for me, and this is where I don't want to lose focus too much, but I really think I need to talk about. This is really hard because I played a little bit of a role in this, so I feel a little
Okay.
bad. I feel really bad for how we treat Tyler Posey. Like, we basically turned him into a piece of meat. There are times in some of
Mhm.
the stuff that I saw that people took from his OnlyFans and posted in other places,
Yeah.
and there was visible pain in his eyes. And I felt like he gave to the fans in a way where he gave more of himself than he should have.
Hmm.
And I think for me, for Teen Wolf, there needs to be an acknowledgement that unlike Supernatural, where the cast was slightly older and they felt like they could set boundaries, whether we like them or not, whether we like what Jensen Ackles said when people started getting really hard on Destiel,
Hmm.
we should have allowed that cast to set boundaries with us. And that had something to do with the age of the people acknowledging the show. But when I think about Teen Wolf, I think about a legacy of a fandom gone a little feral in a way. And I think about, how many people captured like celebrity dick pics, essentially, from this show and collected them like they were trading cards, not remembering, yes, they're hot, but these are real people and real actors. And so, especially when I think of this show, and I don't
Mm,
feel, I feel like it's better now. I feel like Tyler Posey is in a much better place. But for
mm,
a while, he was basically a tattooed love boy for the pleasure of his fans. And you can feel free to come at me and tell me I'm wrong about that. But there are some of those videos that were taken off his OnlyFans that people didn't pay for or took after they paid for them just so they could post them. And I think it's a big problem.
mm,
And I say that saying that, yes, I saw them. So I will admit that I am part of this and that I did not stop that. I did not go to a webmaster and say, please take this down. So I looked and I will admit to that. But it's also that we took this idea of this werewolf fantasy too far. Um, it didn't happen as much with Stiles and Derek. I felt that a lot of that was that Red Riding Hood fan art, which you can interpret a myriad of ways, and we can talk about a
mm.
little bit.
Yeah.
But I feel like it didn't happen with the female members of the cast that I saw, and maybe that was just my corner of the internet. But we didn't get a lot of that sapphic, and it all felt hyper
No.
focused on perceived masculinity of these characters too. So
Yes, I wonder. So I'll touch briefly on what you were just saying about Tyler in a second. Um, actually, I better
maybe
touch
we
on that
should talk if
first.
we should call him like Posey because of his last name instead of Tyler, because we got two Tylers
Yeah.
as main
True,
characters.
true.
You
Okay,
can call him Posey and Hoach.
yes. So Posey, I do see your point. So when he started the series, um, he was fresh-faced 18-year-old. So they really did choose someone that almost matched the age range of what they were looking for. And he kind of grew up within this role. It finished in 2017. I believe by that point he was 26, 27. So he'd really developed and matured during that time period. So I do kind of see where you're coming from. Um, it's the same feeling, really, you get when you look at Riverdale and look at Archie's actor, KG Appa, who again was a similar age and was, dare I say, sexualized as the sort of the main boy role, if that made sense.
Yes.
Um, so I do acknowledge this problem. And I suppose at the end of the day, it's a two-sided thing. It wasn't right for the studio to sexualize its main actor when they're sort of fresh-faced 18-year-olds just going out into the world, because we'd acknowledge it if it was the other side of the coin with female actors and
I
such.
mean, it's
But at the
something
same
like
time, it,
Beverly Hills 90210 had the same problem, but it was not on as high a scale because it felt like the entire cast was sexualized in a way. And here it
oh,
specifically felt to me like it was hyper
yeah.
focused, especially because Posey was kind of teasing it
The-
along, but I don't want to victim blame, but definitely
yeah,
it felt out
but
of.
wasn't the new version of nine? No, I'm gonna get this wrong. 90210. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, they did a
Was
reboot
it?
of it,
Was
but it was
yeah?
always
Wasn't
Beverly
the
Hills 90210. So yeah.
wasn't the poster for that, if I remember correctly, the six main young cast members, and they were all in their swimwear in the pool, showing off their, fit bodies, shall we
I
say?
don't think
I
the iconic Beverly Hills 90210 shot is them in kind of this weird laying down group hug pile, all in white
Okay.
t-shirts and jeans. I'm not sure what you're thinking of, but that is so. It's not
Yeah.
something that is.
Mm.
It is a part of the studio system youth thing of hypersexualizing every cast, but pretty much except for Glee got hypersexualized to sell stuff. So it's also like a part of the genre. But for me specifically, when I think of Teen Wolf, it feels like it got pushed even farther than it did with like Sarah Michelle Gellar on Buffy. Like, and I say this as someone that shipped Angel and Xander hard. Um,
Yes, there it is. I found
there it is.
I found a photo. I'm just showing him now.
Yeah,
They're
I
all
think that must
cool.
be that's the new one on the CW. So the original one
Mm.
doesn't have that, but yeah, I'm not surprised when they did the reboot they did that because part of
Yeah.
90210's canon is Melrose Place, which was like super sexy adult after midnight kind of thing, post 90210. Uh,
So going back to the point about Posey, on the one hand, you got the studio wasn't right to do it, but on the other hand, you had you had the audience that really got into seeing a hot young actor in the lead. Now, you had to look at it from two sides of things. You had to look at whether that behavior is taken a bit too far and you end up sexualizing a character too much. But then you have to look at the side of it's natural for people to feel an attraction to someone that is good looking. And it's not, you've got this gorgeous, fresh faced guy. He's got a really nice personality. So it's understandable why people really liked Posey, both as a character and as an individual. Um,
yeah,
so it's trying to find that line between sensible and good behavior, and also acknowledging the fact that it's not normal to have a crush on someone. And I think that's why people ended up liking quite a few male characters on the show, both from the beginning cast and also the later ones. Liam Dunbar stands out, who was um, Scott's first one of his first beta werewolves.
yeah.
I remember a lot of people quite liked his character and his actor as well. So I
Yeah,
think we just
played
have to.
by Dylan Sprayberry.
Mm,
For me, it's about Tyler Posey being able to have control over his
yes.
life. So I'm not saying that being able to
Mm,
sexualize is always bad. It
no.
does happen in fandoms, but I felt like before we
Mm,
actually talk about the meat of the show, which is what this is all building to, because we really should. Um,
yes.
for me, it really felt like he maybe went farther than he wanted to, and it may have started out as like this 18-year-old guy learning how to sow his wild oats and
Mm,
doing that Leonardo DiCaprio swinging bachelor thing. But by the time he had an
mm,
OnlyFans he was trying to get music off of, and he just happened to be nude for a large portion of it, it
yes.
felt like it became about him. It felt very like, not that it was tired, but like that he was there was a point where he was ready to move on, and it felt like he wasn't allowed to.
Mm,
And I don't feel that way now. I feel better energy
no.
having seen some of the cast photos from the promo stuff from the movies. He looks like he's in a really good place. But like, I can't talk about the show without thinking about like that heavy sexualization that happened for those main three leads. And when we talk about Stiles, I have quite a bit to say about the idea of twink and the idea of what we call sourwolf, which is the Stiles and Derek pairing. I think it's
Yes.
really interesting, but I also think it takes away from the focus of the show in some ways. Not bad necessarily. There are three characters of Teen Wolf that appear in every season. So let's talk about them kind of first. Obviously, Tyler Posey as Scott McCall isn't every season. He's the main character. The show is about him. Tyler Posey as Scott McCall is turned into a werewolf in the series premiere, and everything just kind of both goes downhill and gets better from there for him. He is the character that you can kind of live through as he both matures as a student in kind of the human realm and as a werewolf, and then later leader of a werewolf pack and a mentor. As much as the Hale family that Derek is from, who we'll talk about a little later, uh, Scott McCall really is kind of the center of this universe, which is Beacon Hills. Whereas like Vampire Diaries Mystic Falls is set in like a kind of Virginia, East Coast. Beacon Hills is a California town. So Scott McCall and gang have like a kind of California vibe. It's not really Twilighty, but it has some shades of Twilight to it. It kind of can't help it because that was just part of the phenomenon of supernatural stuff, whether we like it or not. And for me, Scott McCall's kind of best work happens with Liam, probably because learning how to be a mentor shows a lot of who you are. But there's a very visceral scene that mimics both a coming out story and like a horror movie trope, in which he's
Mm,
locked in jail with his mom, who he's been hiding the secret from about being
yeah.
a werewolf. And that transformation in front of her and kind of this vulnerability of who he
Mm.
is. As a gay man, I can't help but be moved by that, but also just like it fits in a perfect place in the show. His
Yes.
mother's response is really important, and they show that visually and in the script. And so when I talk about Scott McCall as a main character, he's probably on par with Buffy in how much focus he pulls in an ensemble cast, but he also has that ability to be one of the charmed witches wherein they can pull focus, but it's also very much in service to a group. um I found in the earlier seasons Scott McCall was a little twee in kind of that New Girls way that was hard
Mm.
for me. But I think as the series progressed and they let him get slightly more serious, I grew to like him more. But I do appreciate the humor of the early seasons because it's a very fine balance to strike doing horror comedy. So, yeah.
Yes. No, I agree. I don't think Teen Wolf would have been nearly as good as it turned out to be if it wasn't for such a strong central character to kind of anchor the series around. And whilst the other characters had their chance to shine, by keeping him as sort of a constant, despite the turnover of like main and secondary cast characters that happened over the years,
There's a lot of turnover
it
in this
gave a
show. There's a lot
yeah,
of it.
it kind of gave it a bit of a coherence
Yeah.
to it, and I really did enjoy. The fact is, the show felt like it felt like a story of maturing, like from Scott as coming into his own as a very young man. I mean, how you view the whole werewolf as an analogy to coming out or puberty, or the fact that you can view it as sort of like a story from different angles
Yeah.
really like shows that the writing was very solid in that part. And it would have been easy for Teen Wolf to have gone the way of Riverdale, dare I
Yeah.
say. But thankfully, it didn't. And it had a lot to do with the fact that Scott never felt like he was. I'm not sure how to put it. It never felt like Scott was hamming it up and became, even if he had like some jokes and like some humor sometimes, he never became like a silly character.
Yeah.
He always felt his story was quite believable, despite the whole thing of like curses and werewolves and druids and evil
Well,
men trying to create.
yeah, the druids are a bit far, but it's a really compelling story of the idea of maturity. It also helps that the design of the werewolves were designed off of Guillermo del Toro horror. So instead of
Yes.
like an American werewolf in London where it's very visceral and bones are popping and they don't look human at all, there's enough human inside the werewolf that the werewolf inside the human makes
Yeah.
sense when Scott struggles with it in real life.
Yes.
Um, and his best friend Stiles is a big part of the show, Dylan O'Brien's character. And the Wikipedia says with a talent for solving mysteries and fierce loyalty.
Yeah.
But so here's where I kind of deviate in that I don't mind the character, but I did feel like they made Stiles in their quest to create like a Xander Willow mashup character. They
Hmm.
did make him like a little zesty for
Okay.
me. And this is a personal preference about kind of
Hmm.
how I like my characters. I think this is why I like True Blood a little more, because a character like that in True Blood probably wouldn't have had such a big billing. But I think a lot of people were drawn to kind of the zest of Styles. They were drawn to the humor. They were drawn to kind of how effortlessly athletic he is and how smart he is.
Yeah.
Um, and so I don't begrudge anyone that, but Styles really isn't my favorite character, but he does keeps the ship going. There's a great scene in one
Mm,
season when they're all standing in like a puddle of school bus gas or something like that, and they have to like light it with the road flare to get rid of the big evil or something.
mm,
And there's a really heartfelt scene that in any other show would have been so stupid, but talking about how much they kind of all love each other as a pack is really narratively
mm,
satisfying. And of course, his relationship with Derek Hale, aka
yeah,
Sourwolf, is kind of a crux of the show that
yeah.
didn't feel like Dean and Castiel, where it felt like it was such overt queer baiting and teasing the audience. It really did feel like a very organic, sort of begrudging respect into friendship kind of relationship between them.
Mm.
And a part of that is also Derek Hill's tragic backstory, which fuels basically all of the plot narrative of the whole show for when Scott doesn't have anything better to do.
And you could argue that that's a great these are great examples of why, even though Scott is the center of the show, um, these other major characters don't feel lesser in comparison to him. Like they get their own billing. Not all of the main cast get as high a ranking as they do, or like not all the secondary characters are perhaps used as well, but at least it's not a one man show,
Yeah.
shall we say. Um, dare I say, not like in Once Upon a Time in later seasons when Regina was pretty was often pulling everyone along by her
So
skirt
there,
tail.
so there's also something interesting here in Teen Wolf
Mm,
about mentorship that Buffy doesn't do. So
yeah,
Buffy doesn't
no,
have a blood father. She has
no,
a surrogate father in Giles, but Stiles has an Americana masculine dad in the sheriff. And that could
yeah,
have gone very badly. That could have
mm,
been a relationship without any warmth and empathy. And the uh, Scott's mom and Dylan's dad for me sell the show
yes.
because they have the patience of saints, and then once they're brought in on the secret, they don't disown their children. As
No.
opposed to Derek, whose entire family is like broken up and they're all evil except for Derek, essentially. It's like the Scream films where like the villain is always from the one family line. Um, and it's a really interesting juxtaposition in writing a story where it has a lot to do with found family, but found
Yeah.
family in this case includes blood relatives in some cases, not in all. And like the Vampire Diaries, a supernatural trope is taking advantage of those blood ties, those family ties.
Mm.
But here, a lot of gifts that I saw that weren't sexualized really had to do with mom son, dad son dynamics and how
Yeah.
much care there was, even when they didn't understand each other.
And maybe touching on that point quickly about fan family, maybe that's why Teen Wolf had um, a good bit of a following, because the fan family trope, by also including like blood relatives and such, it reflects a more modern attitude towards found family. So in the past, when being gay was more, it was more commonplace to be disowned socially by your family, and so the found family became the surrogate family unit for many LGBT people of the past generation. With societal changes and such, it's becoming more commonplace that you're not, a lot more people are not getting disowned, but they still develop a found family. But it's sort of a mix between, um, you know, your blood relations, the people that are brothers and sisters to you, and that becomes, your established family. And perhaps that's sort of why Teen Wolf felt authentic in that sense, because it showcases that, modern take on family.
And
Um,
unlike Boy Meets World, they don't send them all off to college together, unless that happens in the movie. But that was one thing that was
well,
really hard to suspend disbelief on, was that they all ended up in the same college in Philadelphia. Um,
mm. So you touched upon masculinity before, and I just wanted to quickly touch upon that myself. I think Teen Wolf, yeah, the essence of Teen Wolf very much is in masculine energy. You've got female characters, you've got female love interests, but it really does seem to pale compared to the sort of male on male shipping a lot of the fandom took. And also, the fact is that it's very clear that the male cast are the, you know, stars of the show. Um, that's not trying to be detrimental to the female members of the cast.
Yeah.
It's just sort of how it was. And I wonder if that's partially to do, like, even though this is billed as a teen drama, I think it was subtly directed more towards female viewers rather than perhaps male
There,
viewers.
there is a sort of male gaze that happens, but
Yeah.
interestingly enough, of the three characters that have
Mm.
been on the show the entire run, the third one is Lydia, who's the genius banshee
Mm.
redhead played by Holland Roden, who starts out just as this popular girl character who slowly revealed who she is, and she kind of
Yeah.
comes into her power. But when we think of Teen Wolf, how many people think of Lydia? You know, if Lydia
Mm.
is your reason for watching Teen Wolf, what does that mean to you that even though she's been around for the whole show, she's one, two, three, four, she is fifth build in the Wikipedia entry of characters on this, even
Mm.
though she's the third longest serving cast member. Crystal Reed, who plays Allison Argent, does get second billing. Um, for being in seasons 1 through 3 and season 5, but it doesn't necessarily go in order of who has the most episodes like some shows have done.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, when you look at this, there actually is a really big mix of gender expression. There's not really a trans character that I remember on the show being, but there
No.
are characters that could present more femme or more masc. Um,
Yeah.
and you know, the dynamic of a werewolf being playing so heavily into alpha beta, there is definitely a
Yeah.
masking femming of characters. Even like Liam Dunbar's rage has a shade of, you know, performative masculinity. One of the things I love about
Yes.
Derek Hale actually is in looking at fan fiction of Derek's character,
Mm.
people excusing his kind of sorrow persona talk a lot about things like PTSD and talk about performative masculinity. So in a way that does work, but they also look at the softer side of what it means when he passes that mantle to Scott as the alpha of the pack. It's a really interesting thing to do the alpha beta thing, but then not include the omega version of that,
Mm.
which is
Yeah.
like that piece of the werewolf lore they chose to like not have anything to do with.
Uh,
Um, and it's a really interesting choice. But when I think about like interesting characters in this and how they're portrayed in fan art, it's always the guys. I don't think I ever saw. I may have seen some fan art of Allison Argent as an archer, but unlike Once Upon a Time, where it really felt the fan art was female heavy,
yes.
there's almost no female fan art. And that could be me. That could be my corner of the internet,
No.
but I don't remember any of it.
I know some of it, and I have seen some fan art of stills with some of the female cast and such. Again, going back to the whole thing of everyone ships stills with everyone else. But no, you're definitely right. It's an interesting juxtaposition you actually bring up there. The fact that Teen Wolf feels male leading, whereas Once Upon a Time is very much even more so, I would say, female leading. And
Yeah,
the opposite sex in both of their shows tends to feel like it's in support of the other, even when you have established characters that have been around as long as the other ones. You've got
yeah.
Lydia for Teen Wolf, and you've got Charming for Once Upon a Time. And I'll say it again, love Charming, but I do feel sometimes they struggled to find stuff for him to do beyond being Snow's husband. And I'm trying not to be nasty against the actor or anything there. It just that's just sometimes what it felt like.
Well,
Um,
and when we
uh,
talk about, sorry, go ahead, finish your thought.
oh, I was just going to mention uh, despite the fact that it's a very masculine show, like there's a lot of examples of vulnerability and of the male cast members relying on each other for various things. There's that infamous scene of like Derek when he's in trouble and he needs Stills to be strong. And I think it was he needed to chop off his arm to get rid of the silver that's like polluting his blood. And
Yeah.
he's like, I need you to do this for me. And Stills is freaking out. Well, of course, because you're asking someone to chop off a limb. Um, but I think it's things like that are great scenes of how their relationship did develop beyond antagonistic, eventually towards, as you say, a friendship.
Yeah.
Um, and I do think that fed a lot into the shipping for the two
Yeah.
of them.
That is so something interesting in a Teen Wolf as a male gaze, it also has, if you're looking at Harry Dresden as comparison, because
Yeah.
there's a lot to compare, there's also sort of a female gaze to Harry Dresden in which Harry as a wizard could be very corrupted and very evil, but he's
Yes.
very safe and he chooses like a non-traditional love interest in the female police officer whose name I can't remember. Um, so
Mm.
there's a lot of that reversed here. Um, it's an interesting thing to think through. What does it mean to have a gaze? And so when I say male female gaze, what we mean is when they shoot something with cinematography, the kind of script they write, who are they trying to get to watch it? Are they trying to appeal to what they perceive to be a feminine need for soap opera, a
Mhm.
masculine need to have somebody have their arm chopped off? How are they writing that balance? In Buffy, it had both of those things. There were things that seemed female gazy and male gazy all throughout the series.
Mm.
I would say Teen Wolf had a strong unintended gay male gaze.
Yeah.
Because I think even with someone like Lydia Martin in the earlier seasons, she had this very kind of um, like almost retro Pleasantville baby doll Quinn Fabray dress style going on.
Mm.
And she really kind of stood out against this very modern sensibility of, you know, unfitting baggy clothes and then the tight tank tops they put Derek Hale in when they let him wear a shirt. Um, and the other thing about the show that we should talk about while we're talking about characters is also talking about how mythology is woven in. When I think about
Mm.
druids, when I think about how they form packs, so
Yes.
I'm thinking about Boyd. And when I'm thinking about things like art and show and bringing in something like Japanese mythology that is so heavily specific, that is a
Yes.
really important thing to talk about this show that no other show really did, not even Angel.
No.
Um, yeah.
No, I completely agree. You mentioned Harry Dresden earlier. One of the reasons I love that book series is the author makes an effort to establish the mythology, the rules, and the background of each aspect of the world he's creating at the time, but also builds on previous information that he's brought out as well. And something that Team Wolf did very well was, as you say, introduced all these variations of different mythological creatures. Start off with your common werewolf, of course.
I mean,
But
it is a
for
mythological,
example,
even though we see it all the time, it is a mythological creature, believe it
yes,
or
indeed. But it then went into were coyotes. How many people in mainstream culture would have heard of were coyote
not. And
before?
it's not just a one off, it's also an
No, no, no.
important plot point.
Hmm. Yes.
And even if it seems like a one off to begin with, it actually like folds around an entire season. The fact that Lydia is a banshee, which is an
Yes.
Irish mythological figure that is,
Mhm.
if you ever seen the Peter O'Toole Leprechaun movie, banshees are scary as hell. They really are. Um, there's also something here about how the mythology of how a pack is formed is broken down
Yes.
because Derek forms his own pack in season 2, and it's a pack that he leads, even though he hasn't passed on, but he's not going to be the alpha. You can already see that being telegraphed from a mile away. It's going to
Mm.
be Scott. But there's this idea of when we think about how packs are formed in a lot of in werewolf pop culture, it's really
Mm.
like these are the two packs in town, and you have to join one of them, and it's like a very Romeo and Juliet thing. Here, there's a
Yeah.
variety of packs. There's, packs that are evil that are bent on revenge.
Yeah.
There's, Derek creating his own found family with Erica and Boyd, and then having Boyd go feral could be read as being racist, but could also just be read as really good TV. But it's really hard
Mm,
because he was the only African American character really on the show. Um, and so
mm.
that's a great storyline, but also doing that with the only black actor seems kind of um, but it's an interesting thing of how they built their families and how they built in this mythology. It seemed like everything that Jeff Davis did felt very intentional.
Yeah.
Even with all the plot points and all the cast changes, that cliffhanger at the end of season one, where we find out that Colton Haynes is a reptilian Kanama and is being
Yeah.
controlled instead of getting what he wants to become a werewolf, which is a very intimate, like seductive thing, the way he propositions um, Derek Hale at the end of season one,
Mhm.
and then to have that fallout continue in season two, and not to have it just go away and never mention it again. There's a
Yeah.
way this world is constructed, both with mythology, even though the druid thing seems a little contrived. They can't all be hits. Some of them have to be misses. It's just the law of averages. But there's a way how you build things. There's a way how you bring in like Lyndon Ashby, and then you've got Alan Parrish as the Hellhound, having the deputy reveal as a
So,
Hellhound.
yeah. Mm.
And the great, I still remember the pictures of seeing the makeup on him where the actor looked like burnt on his entire body, and I just think that's great makeup technique.
Mm.
Um, and then you have the hunters of the world. You have J.R. Bourne, who comes in as Chris Argent. You've got Allison, who has to hide her relationship with Scott McCall for a
Scott,
while.
yeah.
It's so good, really.
It, it did feel like they were trying to do a Romeo Juliet thing between Scott and Allison.
Yeah.
But I wonder if that kind of like as the story developed, it kind of feels like that petered out a little bit. They decided to
Well,
go with
if
different
you if you
things.
start it if you start it when they're 18, it probably should peter out.
Yeah.
This was something they talked about on Buffy, but not on Vampire Diaries. Is this
Mm,
idea of how you change and grow? How you,
yeah.
I think it was actually good that Scott had these different desires and love interests. I do kind of wish
Mhm.
he would have had a queer love interest just for like, because they went to like a
Wow.
gay rave and they talked about bisexuality. It seems like I don't need him to cross that line with Liam because that's still a mentorship thing, and I do think there is some sacredness there. Uh,
Yeah.
but like
Well,
there
well,
could have been a moment. It
well,
could have
we
easily happened.
we don't know what's going to happen in the film.
It's true.
Just saying.
We are recording
I
this
think
before the film has come out. I don't even know when it's coming out. It should be coming out this year, I think. I don't.
in terms of just to touch on it quickly while I remember this. Yes, so Colton Hayes' character Jackson does come back in season six as they're all building up towards the explosive conclusive arc of the story. And he's in a relationship with Ethan, who's played by Charlie Carver, I think. Yes, he and Colton both came out as gay in real life, and they kind of wove that into the story, I think,
Yeah.
by having them sort of somehow meeting up and then getting together, sort of thing.
It's very Umbrella Academy where they did that for Elliot Page.
Yes.
So it's nice that we live in a world where that can be done, because that kind of not knowing yourself and coming to yourself later in life, we don't really have that a lot. It's growing more in media, so it's nice to see. We can talk a little bit. I think we should talk about the role of evil in this show, because when you think
Mhm.
about in mythology, the idea of good and evil is really always omnipresent. If you look at a horror movie, even if
Yeah.
it's just like the bad guys that are chasing people in a haunted house, there is always an evil. But in this show, it does
Mm.
have a lot of Buffy in it, in that the evil is sometimes high school getting in the way of you doing the thing you actually need doing that's important. It's not
Yeah.
such as Sarah McLachlan this time, um, but there's a lot of ways in which Derek Hill has to do with having family members that are evil. Like you look at um, Ian Bonham, I think, plays Peter Hale, who is kind of
Mm,
a big bad of the first season and then gets resurrected later and messes
yep.
with Lydia psychically. There's, you've got J.R. Bourne, who plays Chris Argent, who is Allison's father, and he has to learn how to trust Scott. So
Mm,
there is a suspicion of werewolves in this universe. It's not that everyone automatically thinks they're evil, but there is
no.
heavy suspicion. And uh, poor Derek Hale, all by himself in that big house, and then his whole family is fake killed in a fire. And then throughout the series, we find out nobody in his family died in that fake fire. Literally, like they just had
He
like
just
an arson plan and didn't tell Derek. Uh,
they just inflicted
that's what it felt
PTSD on
like,
him.
really.
Yeah.
That's what it felt like.
Ugh. No, I see what you're saying there, and this has always been one of my major complaints with the hunters as a concept. I I think I might be the only one to think this. I don't like the notion of hunters because at the end of the day, you're people look chasing after other people really to kill them. And I know like they're hunting werewolves and such, but werewolves are still people at the end of the day, as are a lot of these other mythological creatures they're hunting down. I'm not saying that some of them aren't evil. I mean, you've got good hunters and you've got bad hunters, but I suppose just from a moral stance, the notion that these people think they're righteous for hunting down supernatural creatures and killing them, regardless if they're good or bad, just sort of irks me on a personal level. But I wonder whether that also partially comes from the fact that I know what it's like to be discriminated against by people that tend to view you in a villainous way with, homophobia and such.
Yeah.
Might be my own experiences sort of clouding my thoughts on that one.
Okay. So there's two things I want to talk about here before we end because we now are at 10 minutes. I would
Okay.
like to talk about two ideas. So I want to talk about the idea of this character that Stiles play. I have to look at the word because I'm going to pronounce this wrong. The Nagatsune.
Okay.
This is one of the most startling characters
Mm,
um, that I think the entire show did. This idea of this like almost a dream demon. I think
mm,
it's a really interesting idea of how it kind of corrupts Styles and it makes him paler and it takes away all the humor and it makes him like this very deadly character.
mm,
I found that a very like daring idea and it really showed the range Dylan O'Brien could bring going from
mm,
kind of this very light to dark and the idea of this like medical mystery slowly eating him from the inside out. It
mm,
kind of mirrors what happened with Jackson in reverse, where Jackson's change to the reptilian Kanama is really different, and his journey as a werewolf is really different.
yes.
I like the idea of the Nagatsune, or also called the Void, um, and I appreciate that also as a reference later to the coming Japanese mythology that came after. So
Yes. And also, it was a good way to appease the people that have been hammering away. The fans have been saying, we want Stills to be a werewolf, or we want him to get some sort of supernatural powers. But at the same time, allow him still to be human. And I know that this was a very conscious choice on the behalf of the writers that they always wanted like a strong human member of the pack, a strong human cast member. So they never wanted Stills to become a werewolf because they wanted sort of that humanity within the pack, if that made sense.
yeah,
Um, and allowing then by creating the Nagasaki, sort of allowed Stills though to because it wasn't really his darker side because he was possessed, wasn't he?
yeah,
By this.
it wasn't him. It
Yeah,
wasn't
it,
like something
you
awakened
see,
him. It was something took
no, no,
over him. Yeah.
yes. So it allowed him to be able to play a villainous role without taking away what made him a great character as a person.
It's
Yeah.
also a great shock too,
Yes.
because most of the
Oh
other
yeah.
season finales had to do a lot with togetherness and kind of this friend romance in a way, because there is a
Mm,
romantic element to
yeah.
friendship in a lot of ways.
Mm,
Um, and this is like very counterpoint to that. This is also a
mm.
really great show for
It's-
people that love indoor spaces, because a lot of this stuff
yeah.
happens indoors, in basements and hospitals, in the sheriff's office, in the little
Oh,
jail cells they got
I
there. Yeah,
yeah.
it's a great
It's right.
place if you like indoor spaces as opposed to a lot of outdoor spaces, because it's a very indoor show in a lot of ways.
Which is again another interesting juxtaposition when you consider a lot of werewolf mythology happens outside in rural locations. This is definitely making it more of an urban fantasy
They
feel.
they do go
Mm.
outside. There is some outside. There is like a whole forest happening in
Oh
Beacon
yeah.
Hills, but a lot of the
No,
show happens indoors.
I think the shock of Stiles being a villainous role was only probably equated to um, Willow from Buffy when she um, became
Yeah.
evil. Would you say that when she became corrupt by her magic?
Well, it was
And
so that was an allusion to addiction. And so when we talk about Buffy, that's going to be a multi-part series, because I think each
yeah,
season is its own thing, and or at least
yeah.
6 episodes probably for that, because 1 and 2 can probably be done together.
Oh
Uh, but yeah, that's in the future. We're not doing Buffy
no,
for.
no, no, no,
I
no.
don't have the
We're
energy
not
for it.
touch, no,
Not
no, we're
yet.
not touching that at the minute. Um, so what was your other point?
The other one was, did the idea of mentorship, of creating a hierarchy pack structure, did that succeed in Teen Wolf? Like, did they succeed in having it be this very mentorly feeling, other than because we had an alpha pack that did come in that did have a very
Mm,
much stricter hierarchy, more
yeah.
militaristic in a way. Do you
Mm.
feel like the idea of mentorship came across really well? And then finally, I want to finish with the question of, did Teen Wolf successfully balance the idea of high school versus harrowing adventure, or did the high school portion get in the way? And we can
Mm.
end on that. But first, the idea of the approach of, did it do well by the idea of mentorship, which seemed to be Scott's MO over the idea of the traditional pack hierarchy, where it's the alpha says go and you go, or
Yes.
stay, as it were.
Um, I think it. I think it did. I think the way that they managed to do it well was the fact is Scott was always portrayed as a very considerate and empathic character, and the first part of the show was him finding his feet, and then the second part was him gradually developing into more of this leadership role for the defenders of Beacon Hills or whatever you want to term them as. And that's why they were able to naturally evolve him to the point where he did have his own betas, really like his own you say mentees, almost feels a bit like surrogate younger siblings, um, in a sense, because of the closeness of their relationships with each other. There was he had two. What didn't he? He had Liam, who had his anger issues and such, and Liam came to heavily respect Scott. And then he had I forget her name. She was a chimera, and she requested that Scott give her the bite so she could survive. And then she became as close to him as Liam was. But I forget what her name was. Um,
I wouldn't be able, all the names really did blend to me after a
yeah.
while I was doing. I had to keep looking up people. So I'm sure the fans of the show are gonna get really angry at us that we can't remember some of the cast names. But in our defense, this show took 6 seasons, and the amount of
Mm.
cast, that ensemble in the show, I do not envy the Beacon Hills high administrative staff in trying to keep up with it, let alone the people watching it.
Yeah.
Um, and I just kind of want to end in our last couple of minutes asking the question that I asked about the first 3 seasons of Buffy, essentially. Did the work of using high school get in the way of the show, or was it so well blended that it seemed important? Because there were episodes where it seemed silly, But then there were the episodes where it gave it the structure and the resources it needed
Mm,
to fulfill the plot. So did it succeed? And I'm going to ask the same question if we ever do Buffy.
mm.
So then we'll have to grapple
I
with
don't
that.
know.
But for Teen Wolf,
I would argue it did, and that it did succeed. And the reason I say that is Teen Wolf was always focused on this story of maturing, this story of someone that's going through um, dramatic changes in his life, going from um, the young buck at school and then becoming like a fully fledged adult in his own right and standing up on his feet. And the the thing is, school is such an important formative element of pretty much everyone's maturing that it would be crazy almost not to have school as quite an integral part of that. And a lot of, to be honest, when you consider it's a teen drama as well, the school setting serves as a great point to have said drama in it.
yes.
So it really
Yeah.
functions well in that side of things. I mean, nothing's perfect. It probably was detrimental at times in some aspects, but we would have to have a real breakdown of each point to do that.
I'm not doing that. We did that
No,
with once. It needed it for once. It doesn't need it for two.
no. Yeah.
We have less than a minute left. Do you have any final thoughts about Teen Wolf that you're, dying to share?
Um, just a simple fact is like it's clear that Teen Wolf was such a phenomenal hit, and it's still informing popular culture to this day. In a way, it's the werewolf show that people know about, and it's clearly got a lot more miles in it because we're about to have the movie.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
if you enjoy the show, want to be part of Beacon Hills, are angry at us that we missed a cast member that you loved, or have anything else you'd love to say, feel free to hit us up on social media. We'd
Yeah.
love to be able to talk more Teen Wolf with you.